So today I'm back in this seat. Last week Hojo-san was filling in for me, filling in for him. Now I'm just filling in for him. So although Hojo-san is in town, of course he is continuing to prep for the November Genzo-e, and I hope get a little rest. So last week I was in South Carolina. I was actually on a plane back from South Carolina, deployed with the Red Cross for disaster relief work around the remains of Hurricane Florence. So I was working in a shelter and taking care of that, and some of you have asked about that experience. And I'm happy to talk about that, so maybe during the Q&A or during the discussion time, I'm happy to say some things about that. I don't want to take up everybody's time with it in case some folks don't care. But a few folks have asked some questions and wondered about that, and I'm happy to talk about it. It was actually a really meaningful time. I'm glad I went because I learned a lot. It was real practice. So we can talk about that later on if we want to. However, of course, when I'm sitting in this chair, we're taking as our text the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, because that's what I do. So you'll recall that the 108 Gates is a piece of text that got included in the 12-fascicle version of Dogen Shobo Genzo. It's not a piece he wrote. It's something that just got set down in there. So last time we began a discussion of the Brahmavihāras, or the 4 divine abodes, which is, as we've moved through this text, we're now into a part of the text where we're talking about those 4 things. So last time the Dharma gate was loving kindness, the first of those 4 Brahmavihāras. And this time our topic is compassion. So the gate says, compassion is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not kill or harm beings, living beings. So, last time, as I say, benevolence or loving kindness, this time compassion or Karuṇā. We still have sympathetic joy, and we still have abandonment or equanimity as the last ones of this series. So again, cultivating these qualities was said to lead to the arising of the mind of Brahmas, or the mind of gods, the mind of loving gods, or to allow one to live with the gods, and this is why these things are Brahmavihāras, or abodes of gods, heavenly abodes. So the kanji, if we look at the kanji for compassion, there are 2 kanji in that set. The first character has to do with grief, or sorrow, or sadness, right? And of course the roots of the English word compassion mean to feel with somebody. So we get this sense of compassion as feeling somebody suffering along with that person. Entering into suffering along with that person. So our interactions with that person, the actions we take, arise from this understanding, this recognition of shared suffering. And that's what compassion is about. So compassion is really the recognition of the first of the 4 noble truths, right? Life is characterized by suffering. And when we recognize that we're kind of all in this together, and we can share broadly in the suffering of others, this is the arising of compassion. So last time, if you were here for our discussion of loving kindness, you might recall that Sagan asked right at the end, is loving kindness the same thing as compassion? And I said no, because I knew these things were divided up in the noble part, in the Brahmavihāras. There was actually a section on compassion. So I said no, they're not. We saw last time that benevolence was about wishing all beings to be well and happy, right? While compassion is wishing all beings to be free from suffering. So it's a little bit different, right? They're related. It's subtle, but there's a difference. We're working on two different things. Wishing all beings to be well and happy, wishing all beings to be free from suffering. So recognizing the suffering of beings, doing what we can to relieve it or at least not perpetuate it is what this whole compassion thing is about. So again, compassion is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not kill or harm living beings. So the opposite of compassion is anger. Somebody makes a mistake because of his own suffering. We can take it personally. We lash out. Some anger arises, right? Or we can recognize the suffering that's behind this unskillful action on somebody's part and try to help stop that chain or that cycle of pain perpetuating pain, right? We have an opportunity in that moment to stop something else from happening. We can certainly recognize that somebody made a mistake or took some unskillful action. We don't have to condone that. We don't have to, say that that was the right thing to do. But we can watch our own response to that. Is it a reaction of personal anger Or is it a chance to say that person made a mistake because of greed, anger, and ignorance, right? 3 poisonous minds. Person made a mistake, now how can we respond skillfully? Which is perhaps a more compassionate response than this kind of personal anger. So when I first read this Dharma Gita, I immediately thought of this teaching from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Just as I wish to be free from suffering and experience only happiness, so do all other beings. Right? So just as this is true for me, it's true for everybody. In this respect, I am no different from any other being. We are all equal. So my suffering, in its way, is not different than the suffering of other beings. We all have a life which is characterized by suffering. In this way, we are equal with everybody else. I know from my friends who do prison work, one of the things sometimes that they chant when they can do liturgy with the prisoners is they chant the Metta Sutta, or they chant part of this thing which literally says, just as I wish to be free from suffering, all other beings wish to be free from suffering. And if you're somebody who has committed a crime or been convicted of a crime and you're in prison, sometimes there is some work going on with you that says, gosh, I did something harmful to somebody. And apparently, my friends say, chanting this part, recognizing this part, just as I wish to be free from suffering, all beings also wish to be free from suffering, is really helpful. So compassion is understanding that all beings can experience suffering and do experience suffering just as we do. So we don't do harm to them, right? They will suffer just as we would suffer. If something which would cause distress to us will probably cause distress to other beings. So the last time here, let me just say, so part of the issue is when we see others as others and separate from ourselves, we can maybe have a hard time identifying with somebody else's suffering. Right? So our practice leads us to understand there is no separation, and we talk a lot and think a lot and practice a lot with interdependence and interconnection, and when we do, we really see there is some shared suffering there. If that's true, then we have some responsibility to be careful what we're doing. We have some responsibility not to be perpetuating suffering, because other beings will feel that. We can't put that out there and expect people won't somehow be disconnected from that. So we do have some responsibility there. If we understand this kind of shared suffering, and we have this mind of compassion, or heart of compassion, it's a little bit easier to put ourselves in somebody else's place. Right? Nobody is outside of the Buddha way. Everyone has a life characterized by suffering. There is no occasion where that's not true. So if we really deeply understand that interconnection and that no separation, it's a bit easier for us to put ourselves in the place of somebody else, who might really be very different from us. And yet, that commonality is we're all human beings in this form, and we're all dealing with something. So last time we saw that the Mahaparinirvana Sutra was a good source of teaching about the Brahmavihāras. In that sutra, Buddha is teaching about the pure actions of a bodhisattva. So when we're studying this sutra, reading this sutra, we're learning about how to be bodhisattvas in the world. How do we take our practice into the world? So this sutra makes the point over and over again that Buddha views all beings as he does his son Rahula. He views all beings with that same kind of mind. So we as bodhisattvas then are also encouraged to see all beings as we would our own children. So now we have parental mind, right? Nurturing mind. So this is not an easy thing to do. If we look around at all the people we encounter or the people we see or read about, there are people we would have a hard time, right? Sort of considering or treating or viewing as we would view our own children. So in the sutra, people get that and they start questioning the Buddha, his students or the people with whom he's talking. They're thinking, how can that be? This or that person did this really bad thing. Can you, Buddha, really see all of these people as your children? And he says, yes, it's true, I really do. I see them all the way I would see my son. The point here being not to blame or shun or get angry at somebody who perhaps makes a mistake or does something unskillful, but to try to fix that problem so the suffering doesn't perpetuate. Take some action to ameliorate the suffering or at least not perpetuate it and bring it onto other beings. So Buddha says it's like seeing that your okesa has a hole in it and simply repairing it, right? So if you see that your robe or your rakusu or whatever you're wearing has a hole, you don't get angry about that, you simply repair it. So if this is a metaphor for the Dharma, somehow there's a gap in the Dharma, right? We can work with that in a way which is compassionate. So if there's a tear in the Dharma fabric somewhere, something's out of alignment, we have some opportunity to work skillfully with that. Suffering arises because something's out of whack. Something doesn't line up. We're not seeing the whole picture. We're sort of tossed away by our delusion. We have some expectation. We have some perception, craving, aversion, all that stuff, right? Somehow there's a gap. There's a tear in the Dharma fabric, if you will. So our job as bodhisattvas is simply to mend that tear so people don't keep falling through the hole, right? If there's a hole and we keep falling down into one of the hell realms, we have an opportunity to do something about that. Let's just mend that tear. So the Buddha sees beings falling into hell with their suffering, and because of compassion, he tries to do something so it doesn't keep happening. And that's what we as bodhisattvas can continue to do as our practice. So the sutra says, and this is the Buddha speaking now, should I see but one person falling into avicii hell, I would, for the sake of that person, stay in the world for a kalpa, or less than a kalpa. I have great compassion for all beings. How could I cheat one whom I regard as my son and let him fall into hell? Seeing a person falling into hell, I cause repairs to be made and bestow the precepts for good deeds. So Buddha could have seen people making mistakes, falling into hell realms, whether that was the monks he was practicing with or people in the community or people he ran into. You know, he dealt with rulers of countries and all kinds of people. He could have seen people making mistakes and just sort of gotten angry and written them off and just said, you know, I don't want anything to do with you. And this is, of course, not what he did. Instead, he provides some teachings, some guidance for these people, creates some precepts so that he can guide people the way he would guide his child, right? So a parent might make a rule that the child doesn't go out, you know, into the busy street because it's dangerous out there. When the child is older, she understands on her own, I need to not go into the street, it's dangerous. But in the beginning, there needs to be some guideline. There needs to be some precept, something we can hold on to. And I think precepts are like that. I've always felt that precepts and some of those guidelines are handrails, Dharma handrails, that my ancestors have given me until I can let go and walk by myself. But until I know how to do that, the compassionate thing is for my teachers to correct me or to give me guidelines or precepts or rules or something, right? So in the beginning, we need some help until we see clearly on our own how the universe works, what we need to be doing, what the compassionate, skillful response is. At that point, we let go of the handrails. And we perhaps do something which is unexpected, which is okay, right? If it's the skillful response in that moment, that's really fine. So this is how we're encouraged to approach the world. Seeing the suffering of beings, seeing what suffering leads to, seeing how it arises, what we do about it. So when we wake up, we can see enough to keep some of our own suffering from arising, because we can see what's happening and sort of keep it from escalating when we get smart about ourselves. But for now, we need help and others need help. So this is compassion. We can see that it arises from right view, right? From the Eightfold Path. Right view is simply understanding the nature of suffering and how suffering arises. If we understand that, compassion can arise naturally and skillful action can arise naturally. So this clear, deep understanding of the nature of suffering is really the basis of our compassion. If we don't understand suffering, we don't understand compassion. We don't know what to do about that. Not long ago, I did a couple of one-day workshops around the region, not here, which, interestingly, in both cases, the Sangha wanted to talk about peace. How is our practice related to peace? How does it generate peace? What is that about? And I came back and said, we're going to talk about suffering. We're going to spend all day talking about suffering. And I thought, no one's going to come. Because nobody wants to talk about suffering. But you have to do that if you're going to get to peace, right? You can't understand what peace is unless you see how suffering arises, how it perpetuates, what we need to do about it. So I had to say to these groups right off the bat, we will get to peace. But first, we need to understand suffering. So this is what right view is about. So now we can see how wisdom and suffering are wisdom and compassion are connected, right? Sometimes when we teach people Gasho, we say one of the non-dualities that this represents is wisdom and compassion. And you can't have one without the other. If we're only wise, and we're simply saying a lot of things which may be true, but can be painful, that's one part of this sword. We need the other part that says, how do we have some compassion on that? How do we provide hard truths in a helpful way? Right? So we need, and at the same time, if we only have compassion, we feel sorry for beings, but we don't have any wisdom to work with it, we can do some things that aren't really helpful. We can enable some further suffering. So we really need both of these things, wisdom and compassion. We need to have this aspiration to relieve the suffering of beings. We also have to have enough wisdom to see what's actually happening here. How is this suffering really arising? And what is the really skillful thing to do? Or we can fall into some real pitfalls. So, just feeling sorry for somebody isn't enough, right? In a way, it seems to me, this idea, I feel sorry for you, somehow still means your suffering is not my suffering. I'm out here thinking, boy, I'm glad what happened to you didn't happen to me. I feel sorry for you, right? So there's nothing wrong with sympathy, but can we do that in a way which really, in a way, enters into somebody else's suffering? Can we walk with that person in a particular way? Instead of, I'm sorry for you, and I'm glad I'm not in your position. Because we kind of are in that person's position, if we can put ourselves in that person's shoes. So, Dogen's teacher, Tendo Nyojo, tells us really also how Zazen and compassion are connected. So we've got wisdom and compassion. Let's look at Zazen and compassion, because we might wonder, how does our sitting practice feed into this thing? So he says, the Zazen of Buddhas and ancestors places primary importance on great compassion and the vow to save all living beings. In Buddhas and ancestors' Zazen, they wish to gather all Buddha Dharma from the time they first aroused Bodhi mind. Buddhas and ancestors do not forget or abandon living beings in their Zazen. They offer a heart of compassion even to an insect. Buddhas and ancestors vow to save all living beings and dedicate all the merit of their practice to all living beings. Right? So this vow to save all beings means to liberate all beings from suffering, and this is great compassion. So this is the kernel, really, of the whole thing about compassion. The most important, basic kind of compassion is the first of the four bodhisattva vows, right? Beings are, I'm bound to liberate all beings from suffering. It's right there, right? It's like one of the first things we learn when we come to practice. This is really what our practice is all about. So again, in this quote, Buddhas and ancestors do not forget or abandon living beings in their Zazen. So again, we're reminded we're not sitting in isolation for our own benefit. We might come to Zazen originally thinking, well, I'm going to deal with my stress, or I want to have some peak experience or something. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it gets us on the cushion. Right? This is how bodhicitta starts. So there's all that suffering and aspiration is kind of our friend. But once we get on the cushion and we start practicing, we realize we're not practicing for ourselves alone. We're not alone in our practice. And there's some larger benefit that's happening here. We're sitting really in order to liberate all beings. We might not get that intellectually, and that's okay. But we start to understand we're sitting with all beings and to liberate all beings. So Zazen is not about closing ourselves off from the world. Yesterday we did a one-day sitting here. We had 20 people in the Zendo. One of those people was a person with a service dog. And she said in the beginning, he's going to make noise. He's a dog. And I said, you know, that's okay, because our Zazen does not require complete silence. We ought to be able to sit Zazen in a train station. Because there's no, this is my Zazen, I'm protecting from all y'all. Right? Where the barriers go down, we're letting the whole catastrophe in. So whatever's going on is part of our Zazen. And if that's true, then there's no being, there's no living being which is separate from our Zazen. Right? We're not sitting in isolation. We're not closing ourselves in a room so that we can focus and concentrate and not have somehow contact with all of these other things out here somewhere. Out here. Somewhere. Right? So we let the whole world in. And in that way, we don't forget living beings or abandon living beings in our Zazen. We're all present together. Compassion is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not kill or harm living beings. So if compassion is the whole point of our practice, and we're putting all of our attention there, then it's not possible to harm beings, because anger and ill will is the opposite of compassion. So if we're focusing on compassion, anger and ill will don't arise, or arise in some lesser way. And we can't harm beings. So it really does become a gate of Dharma illumination. These things begin to cancel each other out, maybe. So we can see how central great compassion, and in the text it's capital G, capital C, great compassion. We can see how central this is in our practice and in our tradition. And if so, then it's no wonder that Kannon is such an important bodhisattva in this tradition. So Kannon is the embodiment of our aspiration to free all beings from suffering. So that's a really central part of our practice, which makes this bodhisattva really important. So one of the manifestations of Kannon is a Kannon with 1,000 arms and eyes. And maybe you've seen these statues, right? Nothing but arms. And in the center of each palm is an eye. So Dogen wrote a whole fascicle about 1,000-armed, 1,000-eyed Kannon, which we can't possibly completely go into here. It's actually kind of a difficult fascicle. But he says that Kannon's whole being is hands and eyes. So in other words, compassion fills the universe. It's not that here's Kannon, part of Kannon is a hand and an eye. Kannon's whole being is hands and eyes, seeing suffering and helping with suffering, right? It's a complete manifestation of compassion. So there is no, I see suffering with my 1,000 eyes and I'm using my 1,000 hands to help. That's already dividing it up. There's just 100% compassion. It's compassion that's already there. It's not something we have to go looking for. It's there if we get out of the way. So Kannon's whole being, and our whole being, is compassion. The eyes are seeing everywhere, the hands are helping everywhere. Everywhere there are suffering beings that need to be liberated, somehow compassion is working there. So there are a lot of stories in the medieval Buddhist tale literature about Kannon manifesting in various forms to save somebody in his or her hour of need. It might be curing an illness, it might be saving somebody from disaster, danger, fire, flood, something like that. Sometimes it's about helping the poor who need food or some kind of success in their lives in order to feed their families. Sometimes it's about having a child, praying to Kannon to have a child. Sometimes it's about liberating oneself or one's parents from a hell realm. So all these things in the tale literature about Kannon manifesting in some form. Sometimes it's Kannon and sometimes it's Kannon in some form we don't recognize till the very end of the story when it's revealed, this was the behind-the-scenes working of Kannon. The behind-the-scenes working of compassion, which was already there, and we just didn't see it. So these Kannon stories are among the most popular kind of tale literature. In the Buddhist tale literature, these are among the most popular kind of stories. I've got to think it's because everybody's suffering, right? Everybody's been in a position where, gosh, you wish there was a Kannon to manifest for you and pull you out of the fire or save you from whatever it was. You know, this is our human condition. So everybody suffers. We'd all like to be saved, right? So you may know that Avalokiteshvara in India, this bodhisattva in India, was male. And somehow as the tradition moves down the Silk Road and across the world, it arrives in China, this figure becomes Kuan Yin and begins to become female. By the time he gets to Japan, Kannon is typically a female character. The male version was said to represent compassion in a general way. The female version is said to represent compassion actively. So this is active compassion, right? So it makes sense to me that in these stories, Kannon is actively manifesting in some way to, pull people out of the fire. I just think that's really interesting. So compassion in action is what's important here. So compassion is not just a feeling. It's not me sitting here feeling sorry for somebody. It's not necessarily me even sitting here and recognizing somebody else's suffering. It's what do we do about that, right? It's not just a feeling, it's something we do. And we kind of don't think of compassion as being an action. But if we're just sitting here thinking about it, that's only part of the story. That's not bad. That's fine. That's the start. But then, what do we do about it? So I think, again, it's no wonder that in the tale literature, then Kannon keeps showing up, playing some active part in relieving suffering. So Compassion is the gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not kill or harm living beings. So as we move through the world, we do our best not to cause injury, not to cause harm, not to perpetuate suffering. Maybe we can't stop it from arising, but we can stop it perhaps from getting any worse or manifesting in some additional way. So compassion is not about just being nice. All right? It's not just about sort of never doing anything that shakes anybody up. And I think it's easy to think that that's what compassion is about. Well, we don't do this or that out of compassion for somebody because it might make that person uncomfortable, or I don't know. That's not bad, but we know there's a thing called tough love, right? Sometimes the compassionate thing to do is to say the thing that's difficult to say, or to do the thing that's difficult to do. And sometimes that bruises somebody's ego. So we have to be skillful about that, right? Two-edged sword. But as bodhisattvas, sometimes we have to make the hard choice. We got to do the compassionate thing, which may not be the nicey nice thing. So, if I'm drinking on the job, the compassionate thing for my supervisor is to pull me aside and say, look, get it together. You can't go on like that. And if I have my ego wrapped up in this thing, I might feel foolish. I might feel insulted. But, that's probably the compassionate thing to do. Not to mention the compassionate effect on all the people around me who are having to deal with me, right? So it's not easy. That's not an easy situation, but the compassionate thing to do is what's hard. And not necessarily, kind of the nicey nice thing. So preventing harm to beings can mean making a tough call that not everybody's going to like, right? But that's our bodhisattva path. We know sometimes we do something and we accept that there will be some consequence for that. And this practice is not easy. So compassion is not all hearts and flowers and sugary stuff. Compassion is not always a Hallmark card. That's why it can be difficult. So also seeing all the suffering of the world and vowing to liberate all beings is not an easy thing. Sometimes people come to this practice and they read something like the Bodhisattva vows and they think, well, I can't be here because there's no way. I can't save all beings. I can't enter all Dharma gates. I can't completely manifest the Buddha way. I'm not worthy. Or it comes time to take precepts and people say, I can't take the precepts because I know I will break them. Yes, you will. That's just the nature of it. So, how can I see all the suffering of the world, enter into all the suffering of the world, walk with all the beings in the world who are suffering when I can't even manage my own? That's not an unreasonable question. If we take it on like Karuṇā takes it on, though, there is no such thing as compassion fatigue. Maybe you've heard about this thing called compassion fatigue. So if we take it on like Karuṇā takes it on, there is no personal cost. There's no injury to me if I help you, right? So there's no personal cost to ourselves if our egos aren't poking our heads in, because that's where we start to get fatigued. I have a friend who's also a transmitted teacher in the Akiyama lineage, who is a palliative care physician. So you can imagine what she runs into. She really takes her practice to work, not in an overt way. But not long ago, she wrote an article for the Journal of Palliative Care. So this is a professional journal, in which she challenges the idea of compassion fatigue. She actually named this thing, Does Compassion Fatigue? ? Does compassion fatigue? And she says, to say compassion can fatigue assumes that there is a limited well of compassion in each of us. Once it's used up, either we must replenish the well or move along without it, devoid of our compassion or with impaired compassion. So she's challenging the idea that this is my compassion. If compassion, now she has to be careful not to write in a completely Buddhist way, because she's writing to her peers, right? So I'm going to extrapolate a bit what I think she's actually saying. If the universe is completely compassion, if Karuṇā with his or her 1,000 hands and eyes, if that whole being is compassion, there is no end, right? There is no sort of finite container of compassion. When we use it up, we're done. Instead, if we just wholeheartedly focus on this moment without worrying about where else we should be, what else we should be doing, what is this costing me to have compassion for somebody, we have some opportunity to show compassion without burning out. As long as it's tied to my ego, as long as it's tied to my idea, as long as this compassion is my compassion, I get tired. How many more people can I see today that are suffering and want something from me? All right? Now I've created a barrier. So she makes the point that even our self-care strategies can actually work against us when it comes to this compassion. If we've got some self-care strategies, like I know after work I'm going to take a walk, or I'm going to take a hot bath, or I'm going to do something, sit zazen. I'm getting through my day of suffering in order to get to this thing out here, which is going to save me. So in order to get through the day, to get through our sort of real life, to get to our leisure time or our self-care, and that's the only place that self-care can happen, we're working against what's really going on, right? So I'm speaking here now specifically of compassion fatigue, because yes, we need physical rest. Yes, we need downtime. Yes, we need to do activities other than work. But what if we can figure out how, in the midst of working with suffering beings, not to have that be an energy drain, a compassion drain, so that we don't rely quite so heavily on I have to get through my day to get to something else which is going to save me, right? And we don't usually think of it that way. Because we think, oh, self-care strategies, fantastic. And they are. I mean, when I was in South Carolina working in the shelter, I was making sure everybody was doing self-care. And at the same time, what if we can figure out how to do that all the time? So that self-care is not separate from our work with suffering beings. It's an interesting idea, right? Where our practice can really come in. So rather than relying on going somewhere else other than here and now to recover from compassion fatigue, if we understand what compassion really, really is, then real compassion doesn't cost us anything. So perhaps what gets in the way is the idea that somehow we should be able to finish the work. We should be able to completely relieve all the suffering of all the beings that we come across. Not possible. We already know that. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. I mean, we know right now. We can't possibly completely carry that out. It's a never-ending, it can become this kind of never-ending uphill slog. I've got X number of patients to see today, or I've got X number of people to help today, right? It can become discouraging. Just because we can't solve every problem for everybody and relieve all the suffering of all the beings doesn't mean we should not do something, right? Hojo-san is always telling us, our practice is not complete. This is why we have vow and repentance. We know, we vow to save all beings, we can't possibly do it. This is why we have repentance, to simply acknowledge our practice is never complete. And to give us, to renew our aspiration to go out and do it again. And do it again, and do it again, and do it again. If we have an idea that somehow we're going to finish, that can be a fatiguing idea. Instead, I've got somebody in front of me who's suffering in this moment. My entire focus is here. There is no boundary to that. Right? I'm not going to run out of compassion because I'm also not thinking about there's 13 more people behind that person. I'm dealing with this person. Right? It's not so easy. But we do our best not to harm beings. So we recognize that one of the marks of existence is suffering. That we all have that in common. We all want to be free from suffering. We all want to be free from harm. And we don't want to harm other beings. So the opposite of harming beings is seeing, again, that all beings are suffering, doing what we can to lessen that suffering, even if it's in a small way. My hands are full, you open the door for me. It doesn't have to be I give $1 million to establish a wing on a hospital, or I'm somehow going to stop all the genocide in the world. We do small things because we can, right? Moment by moment by moment, the universe is presenting us with some opportunity to manifest compassion. We already have it. We already are it. We have some opportunity to manifest it, moment by moment by moment by moment. Whether it's I'm actively going to do something, or I'm not going to perpetuate suffering, right? So we all have some opportunity. And because we are compassion, and because this is the way the universe works, we take that bodhisattva vow that includes liberating all beings. It's not, that vow is not something new for us, it's not something we acquire, and it's not something outside of us. It is an expression of this practice which is already arising. It's an expression of this compassion which is already here. And in that way, again, it's not my vow. It's not me vowing to do something. It's simply an expression of the compassion that's already here, right? So compassion becomes a Dharma gate when non-harming is the natural outgrowth of our wisdom rather than something that we're going to go acquire. It's the natural outgrowth of how we see the world working. And compassion is just there. So it's not something we have to go acquire. It's certainly not something we have to put on in an inauthentic way. Sometimes in the beginning we have to work a little bit at it. Maybe we, bite our tongue instead of saying that thing, right? But ultimately, this is not an act we put on. This is simply what arises in our lives. So for now, we may need to remind ourselves to look for that compassionate response. We have to think a bit about what the compassionate response is to what's happening in our lives. But the more we practice, the more it arises naturally. And it's because there's no gap, right? It's because we just don't see the gap between me and somebody else, or our practice in the rest of our life, or our compassionate work on our self-care. There's just no gap. So our challenge is, I think, how do we get out of the way of our own stuff? How do we get out of the way of the things that hide or hinder this compassion which is already here? Because there is an unlimited well of compassion already here. We simply have to find it, right? And let it out. So what would you like to say about that challenge, or compassion, or anything else that's on your mind today? And please tell me what time it is, because I didn't put a clock in front of me.
We've got 10 to 11 right now.
10 to 11, okay. So we have a little bit of time. And typically this group provides a pretty good discussion. So what interesting things have you got on your mind today? Please, Ritoku.
Yeah, just add an interesting thing that you said about how Avalokiteshvara underwent a sex change en route to the Far East.
Indeed.
I always found that fascinating. And but sort of in between, in Tibetan Buddhism, Avalokiteshvara is the male aspect of Tara, that they reflect each other. So there's already the idea, and it's interesting also that Tara in Hindu mythology is the union of Shiva and Shakti. So you have almost a Jungian animus interlocking of masculine and femininity, like yin and yang. So compassion manifests both in the male and female aspects.
Well, and so here again, how many times in our practice do we see this, right? This coming together of things, right? There really is no separation. So thank you for that background. Other comments? Please, Allison.
At the beginning of your talk, you said, though this text that you're speaking on week after week appears in the Shobogenzo, Dogen didn't write it.
Yep.
And somehow I had missed all that earlier on. And so could you speak about that a little bit?
So the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination is a text from a larger piece called the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. And I think, if I remember correctly, that does no longer exist in the original Sanskrit. I think it's only extant in the Chinese form. But it would, my guess is it would have been fairly well known when Dogen was writing. And so I don't know, I've not been able to find, because I can't read original source material in Japanese, so I don't know. And I should ask Koder-san. So I don't know kind of what the status of that text was in general, but somehow in the 12 Festival version, that thing got picked up and just put down in his Shobogen. So I think maybe he has a few sentences before it and after it. But my thought about that was, when I found it, I thought, geez, Dogen didn't write it. And I thought, but if it got included, it was clearly something that was important to him. Clearly, and if you look at these 108 gates, all of Buddha's teaching is in there. I mean, look at all the things we've already talked about, 3 treasures and Brahmavihāras, and all of these. It's drawing from all of these other texts, and it seems to me like a sort of world tour of, of Buddha's teaching, right? So when I talk about those gates, I like to do a couple of things. So maybe you don't care, but I like to do a couple of things in the talk. One is put it in the context of modern practice, because that's one of the things we do at Sanshin, right? That's one of our sort of 3 reasons for being, is how do we practice in the modern world. But I'd like to go back and say, what else did Dogen say about that topic? Why would that have been important to him? So in this case, it was Tendo Nyojo, his teacher, that I was quoting from. It's like, where does that fit in Dogen's thinking? So how do we bring that into the Soto Zen tradition? Because this text predates Soto Zen. How was he thinking about that when he wrote that, when he included it in this Shobogenzo? So I don't know the specifics of how it got in there, but that's my thinking about it.
Okay, so it's a much older text.
Yeah, it's an older text. I think Chinese is the only version that exists. I'm guessing it's older than that. But anybody who finds out something about that text and wants to tell me, I'd be happy to know, because it's been a little bit difficult to find background on the text to put that in context. But, I'm thinking if it got included in there, these are things that are important. And you can certainly find, Dogen doesn't speak about the Brahmavihāras, but he certainly speaks about loving kindness, he certainly speaks about compassion, he certainly speaks about each of these things in various places. So I like to bring that in too and just see, what was his context for that? Does that help at all?
Yes. And also, another thing that either was new to me or I hadn't absorbed before was when you were talking about
Gasho.
Wisdom and compassion. I don't remember being told that.
Well,
So,
this is, of course, a gesture which predates the Buddha. I mean, this is an Indian gesture. If you go to India, people do this all the time. They're not saying, in the Soto Zen context, but for us, frequently what we hear when we learn to do this is about non-duality. It could be wisdom and compassion. It could be a lot of things. It's a way to kind of bring yourself here. But I think that's really helpful. Every time I see this, I go, oh, yeah, non-duality of something, right? So will you find a formal teaching about that? I don't know. But, so when I'm teaching newcomers or something, I might say, okay, here's what we do. Fingertips are eye level. This is about as far from your nose as this. It's not here. It's not here. It's here. And when you do this, imagine, non-duality, right?
In Hindu, they would say namaste.
Namaste.
Yes, and that still has the non-dual aspect because it's recognizing the divinity of both of us simultaneously.
Exactly. Right. So there is that, I'm not making it up. But I think, we have the opportunity to think there are multiple kinds of non-duality, right? I mean, in the way there's only one non-duality, but non-duality of various things. So it's a helpful practice. Please.
A lot of things that you said this morning made me think about an experience I had this past week. Without trying to get into too many political details, I was at a rally on campus for a local candidate with a visiting progressive senator who was here.
Sanders.
Yes. So I had these two very powerful reactions. One was these people were talking about compassion and about wanting to relieve others' suffering and about not wanting people to be living in poverty or not able to afford health care or not able to afford education, etc., etc. And it was such a relief for me just to be hearing people saying those things, and a lot of people were there who support those ideas. So that really felt good. At the same time, I just felt this overwhelming sadness that not everyone feels that way. And in fact, a lot of people are totally opposed to those ideas. And I was just, how could anyone not want this for everyone? I don't understand it. And then I started thinking, well, the reason people don't want this for everyone is the three poisons.
Exactly.
And so that explains it. But I think my sadness was what I walked away with more than my relief or good feelings. So then and there is this feeling like, well, what can I do about all this? That there's so many people who don't want this for other people and so on and so forth. And I really have a lot of doubts about being able to convince anyone who doesn't feel that way that, well, why don't you see it this way? So I think what you said about just being in the present and focusing on what's right in front of you, maybe that's the answer. Maybe just try not to look at the entire horrible mess, but just something small maybe.
Well, I think we can't ignore the vastness of suffering, but I think we can also recognize we as individuals probably can't ameliorate all of it. So what we do in the world to help can take any number of forms. Knit a hat for the children in the local shelter, all the way up to work for a candidate that you think is going to make change on a larger scale. We as bodhisattvas make use of our karmic conditions. You've heard Hodo-san say this many times. This is not new. We make use of the karmic conditions we have. Each of us has a skill set. Each of us has a certain amount of time. Each of us is interested in certain things. We use those as conditioned beings to ameliorate some suffering in the world. So in this way, being conditioned beings it's not a bad thing, right? We have limits, but we also have talents and skills and aspirations. So each of us can do something. Each of those things is connected somehow. We focus where we can make a difference. And that doesn't mean if we don't want to learn some new skill and help in some new way, we can't do that, But we look around and we just see the vastness of suffering. We just think, oh, I'm not getting out of bed today. And that's understandable from our limited human point of view, right? But there's something we can do. Each of us has something we can do. And that's where we start. So in that moment, we can focus on knitting that hat for that child or whatever it is that we're doing. Bearing in mind that, there's a lot of suffering and this is my little piece of it. This is the little thing that I can do. So the bodhisattva, I think when Karuṇā, part of the names that this figure has means something like he or she who regards the cries of the world or hears the cries of the world. And I have this image of a bodhisattva who hears and sees all of that, and I can't imagine that suffering doesn't arise. I'm sorry, that sadness doesn't arise. How could sadness not arise when we see the suffering of beings? And it is that sadness that I think confirms our aspiration to help. I think that sadness is part of the deal. But I think we can take that on in a way which is not so personal that we become crushed by it. Because I think that's a real danger. I've known practitioners who, they're wide open and they're feeling it all, and they're just, they become crushed by, they look around at the amount of suffering and they just, can hardly go on. And that's an understandable response, but I think in order to be really useful, we have to carry that along with our understanding that there's something we can do. That's not an easy creative tension, but it's what we take on. So I think the sadness is not unreasonable. I think we do feel that. I think it's what gets us motivated to help if we can, and to do the things we can. I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah. I propose that sadness is not a painful emotion.
Yes.
There's something beautiful about sadness. And it's related to, at least in my mind, it's related to why compassion is considered an abode of the gods. Now, I remember first encountering this, like, wow, compassion, it's painful. How could that ever be considered a godly state? And I still don't have a great answer for that, but I do have a larger sense of how sadness is one of the deep and primal emotions that is not unskillful. Okay, so that's part one. And I'd love to hear if you have, or anybody else has more to add to why compassion would be in this category of a godly state. But I also wanted to say, I wanted to bring up two areas where I find compassion very difficult. One is with the people I have the most day-to-day interaction with. And it is so easy for me to be upset or frustrated or irritated and let that be the impetus of action or speech. And then the other extreme is interacting with somebody who is suffering in a huge way, my brother, with alcohol, and how any way that I've tried to interact with him hurts him and me. And to come to the conclusion that it appears the best thing I can do is to love him from afar and not to have interaction, which took me a long time
Of course.
to learn.
Of course.
Because that is not what I
No.
wanted.
You want to solve the problem for him.
Yeah.
If I love you, I'm going to solve your problems. And sometimes it's if I love you, I have to just be present, but not do anything,
Mhm.
which is difficult. Why do you think that your responses to the people you interact with all the time are the responses where are the places where you find it hardest to have compassion?
First of all, I'd like to say it's not zero.
Of course, no, of course. Understood.
But this is what's interesting to
Yeah.
me, is where does it not work well
Yeah.
for me? From my perspective, I'm all in me, and I'm not the level of connection, the level of awareness, the level of openness is not big enough. I'm not sure if that's the best language, because the lens that I'm responding to and reacting from has a lot of me.
Sure, of course. Well, that makes sense. If that's a closer relationship and you're invested in that relationship in some way, then as soon as that relationship feels threatened, it's difficult because there's some self-image, some building of self in there. So if that's threatened, then I'm threatened.
Yes. And Gottman, this guy who's done a lot of research on relationships, he says that in an intimate relationship, one negative interaction takes 5 positive interactions to offset the effect
Interesting.
of one negative.
Interesting.
And I get it, I see that.
But to do it is difficult, isn't it? We can get it here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But awareness is the first important piece there. You're already watching your reactions and your responses, so you're already better able to make a skillful response, or at least to not make an unskillful response,
Yeah.
which is, until we start practicing and really paying attention. What's arising in this moment? What am I doing? Body, speech, and mind is where we create karma, right? So what's going on in body, speech, and mind? We don't have any chance to head it off. Now at least you got some chance to head it off. It's always going to be difficult. I mean, this is our human condition. If this was easy, we'd sit down once and we'd have it. So just having the perseverance is important. Somebody else, I saw a hand. Please.
Not harming the beings. So some monks are vegetarian, some are not. And some say carrots have feelings. So then, what do we not harm to be able to survive? Take care of the vessel.
That is one of the basic paradoxes of that first bodhisattva vow. Or that's one of the basic paradoxes of being a bodhisattva and why we have vow and repentance, because we know we cannot possibly live without harming other beings, because we've got to eat. So that part of our practice can never be complete. And so vow and repentance is about, we vow not to harm beings, we vow to save beings. And on the other hand, we have to eat some beings in order to survive. So we have to accept that karma. There is no way around that. It's just one of those parts of our practice which we're never going to come to the end of. And in the midst of that, how can we create as little harm and suffering as possible? And that's a question each of us has to wrestle with. There's no one answer for that. But what you raise is absolutely a paradox. You know, it's absolutely something we wrestle with every day. So, for instance, I'm sure I've told the story before, you know, when you're in Japan living in a temple and you're surviving on donations, usually where I've practiced has been in quite rural areas. These are not folks who have a lot of stuff, but people still provide our food. When you are living on the food that you know people have donated to you as a practitioner in order to support your practice, my goodness, we don't waste anything. We're grateful for everything. We don't waste a grain of rice because somebody donated that. You didn't just go down to the store and buy that. So coming from a place where at that time I had a good job, I had all the money I needed, I could feed myself quite easily. And yet these people are feeding me out of what little they had. Oh my gosh, what a practice, right? I can't possibly survive except for these beings doing what they're doing. And you really make sure your practice, at least for me, I really made sure I was practicing well, because the only reason I could practice was because they had donated this food out of what little they also had. So can we approach our food, and this is why food practice is huge in this tradition. Our Thursday night group, we happen to be studying that at the moment. This is why food practice is a really big thing, why we chant over our food and say, you know, we're grateful for that. And we recognize beings gave up something so that we can eat and practice. And we better be using that energy to do something wholesome in the world rather than bringing unwholesomeness into the world. It's another part of our practice. But not an easy question. Other comments from people, please.
I was 8 or so when I heard my mom praying for President Nixon. And I said, Mom, he's a criminal. And she said, yeah, that's why he needs our prayers. And it was the first time that I saw compassion in action for someone who was creating more suffering. I didn't quite see it that way, but I knew something is important here, and it took me years to understand. And so it's, and today, like imagining President Trump, like there's a little hump, and then it's possible to recognize that, wow, there's got to be a lot of suffering for what is happening in his life and what he's bringing to our country. And I know other people who can't go there.
It's very difficult.
It's painful. Yeah.
It's very difficult. So when we are finished here, we're going to do our monthly world peace ceremony. And if you recall in that echo, we're wishing some kind of help for those who perpetuate suffering, for those who cause disaster or harm beings. So in that moment, we've chanted the Heart Sutra. We've, if you take it this way, created some merit. Where are we throwing that merit? To the people who really need it. The people who are caught up in 3 poisonous minds, perpetuating suffering for themselves and others. And our challenge is to do that in a way which is not holier than thou. I'm enlightened and you're suffering, and I'm going to tell you why you're suffering so that you don't do these bad things that I think you're doing. It's really subtle, right? Can we meet that person evenly, or that situation evenly, and benevolence, wish that person well, compassion, wish that person to be relieved of suffering, and when we, interestingly, so we've got compassion when we are feeling grief with somebody, but the next thing we're going to talk about is sympathetic joy. We're feeling joy with somebody. So it's not that our whole lives are about feeling only people suffering. We're also going to sympathize with their joyful times. That's our practice too. Again, right? But interestingly in that echo, we're throwing that merit to people who really need our help. In addition to those who are the victims of that, how about the perpetrators? We can't leave them out. Clearly they're suffering, or they wouldn't be causing the kind of mayhem they're causing, whatever form that's taking. Clearly there's some suffering there too. And as bodhisattvas, we don't discriminate, right? We try to help all beings. They're beings. They're not outside the Buddha way. As harmful as what they're doing may be. And again, that doesn't mean we condone it, doesn't mean we think it's okay, doesn't mean we let them off the hook. But we can certainly have compassion for their suffering and wish that things were better for them, right? So we're about to actively, if you want something we can actively do, we're about to actively chant for those folks. And that's not separate from this conversation. Ritoku.
You might help me on this because I may not be remembering this right, but there's the legends of Buddha's previous lives before he was Buddha. one of which had to do with killing someone, and I think it was a captain of a ship, in order to save the ship from disaster. And he's willing to take on the karma of that person.
That's what we
in the
do.
act of killing, but it was still an act of stopping somebody from causing harm.
Right, right. And we run into that, you know, we hear things like, well, somebody's about to hurt a child, what are we going to do? Well, it might be we have to take that person out, you know. Sometimes we, as bodhisattvas, we can create a little bit of suffering in order to head off more suffering. And again, we take that karma and just say, that's our role as bodhisattva. But it's the skillfulness that really is tough. We've really got to be clear. You know, we really have to deeply see how this world works in order to make those calls. So yeah, our life is not so easy. Please.
One thing I've been thinking about lately is that most of us hide our suffering, and
Certainly.
that is necessary lots of times. Like, suppose I'm suffering about something, and yet I have to go to work and do my job and interact with people. So I don't walk in there and say, I'm suffering and here's why, you know. I hide that and just try to function. Nonetheless, the fact that I'm suffering might affect the way I act in a bad way. You know, it might kind of pop out as irritation at some, for example, that normally wouldn't be there. And I think I noticed that in coming at me also from other people. People whom I know well enough to know that they are suffering because I know the circumstances, and then they might say something unskillful, let's say, and then I have to kind of stop myself from reacting and say, oh, that's probably happening because they're suffering. And when I was younger, before I had suffered an awful lot, I don't think I realized that about people. You know, you might be walking down the street and there's someone coming towards you, someone you don't know, and yet they treat you in a nasty way. And that it could be that they're suffering and yet they're hiding.
Or they're suffering and they're not aware of the suffering, right? Until we started this practice, we probably weren't familiar with something like 3 poisonous minds. And I mean, maybe this has happened to you. When I go and, you know, when I meet somebody or they say, you know, what's your practice about? Well, our practice is about suffering. And the first noble truth is we're all suffering. I'm not suffering, I'm just fine.
Yes, I think if we...
Because they don't get, you know, down here we have this permanent kind of dissatisfaction or whatever. So we're, you know, everybody's suffering, but we don't always recognize it, right?
Yeah. Well, President Trump, I don't think if we could talk with him, I don't think he would say, oh yes, I agree, I'm suffering.
Of course not.
He would say, no, I'm wedding.
Of course he would. Of course he would.
Yeah. So anyway, I think there are many circumstances in which people hide their suffering, probably a good thing, but also can cause trouble.
Well, I think there's a difference between I'm hiding my suffering and I'm unaware of or ignoring my suffering.
Right. Yeah.
There are times we keep our stuff to ourselves in order to go out and do what we have to do, which is fine as long as somewhere in our lives we're working with our suffering, which might simply be I'm sitting zazen, you know. And then there's I'm ignoring my suffering, I'm refusing to acknowledge my suffering, I'm pushing away my suffering, which is a whole different ballgame, you know. And I think it's more likely that that's where stuff leaches out in some unskillful way on a regular basis than, you know, if I'm aware of my suffering and I'm kind of working with it, I'm a little better able to head off the unskillful response. So I think, yes, we can certainly acknowledge somebody makes a mistake, you know, it might come from, it might or it probably comes from their suffering. If it's somebody we can talk to about it, gee, you know, last week you said that thing, and are you okay? Because that's kind of like not like you, you know? And sometimes we can't. It's a stranger, or it's somebody far away, or we can't, you know, and then all we can do is, gosh, may you be well, you know? So recognizing somebody's suffering is important, and it's the first step, but it's sometimes not enough. Please.
In response to what you said, I often try to, when I see something happen or someone say something, I try to remind myself that everything has a cause. There's causation operating all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we just see the effect, we see the
Right.
symptom.
Right.
We don't know what brought that on.
Mhm.
But if we understand that there must be some kind of cause behind it,
Mhm.
you know, maybe doesn't answer the question, but at least it kind of relieves a little bit our response to the
Right.
action or the statement.
Right, so that's seeing interconnectedness
Mm-hmm.
in a deep way also, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But we can't see, you know, we can't see the cause.
Right.
But there must be a cause there.
Right, oh, that's interesting.
Which again means we don't necessarily have to let that person off the hook. If that person says something really harmful to me, next week I still may need to sit down with that person and say, you know, I mean, I get you were suffering, but come on, that really hurt, you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean, oh, well, you know, everything's fine, and we don't take some action about it. But I don't come to that person and say, what were you thinking? You know?
Mm.
Geez, that hurt me. Are you okay? Because that's not like what you do. You know, what's going on? Can I help you? Maybe we can't, you know, but if we can, that's a good first step. Oh, so many people. Let's start with Patty and go around.
I was just thinking about that issue about the despair of not being able to keep up with the compassion demands. I guess I was thinking that interconnection is that Hojo-san always draws the picture of Buddha's net and, you know, one dot there. And so I think, you know, I'm just kind of holding together my threads of the net and doing what's coming at me.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a kind of a faith thing that the rest of the net is intact or intact enough, or that there's all these other things I don't have any business dealing with or ability to deal with, but I have to take care of my part. And I don't know if that's like, I mean, I'm kind of a sucker for some, you know, something to make me feel better about the whole mess, but, you know, that's faith, is that right, or not? I mean, you're believing that I'm part of this interconnected universe, even though I can't see all the causes and effects, and I can't see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the beginning, we take it on faith because people who have been on this path longer than we have been on it live in a way which makes that manifests that in a certain way. All of this, that everything is connected. So in the beginning, yeah, we can't see it for ourselves. We take it on faith and we go forward on that basis, and we hold together our strings as best we can. But I think the longer we sit, the longer we practice, the longer we interact with other practitioners, we sort of get some sense that there's, you know, me holding on to my bits, but there's other people holding on to their bits, and there's suffering sort of throughout this thing. I can't personally take responsibility for all of it, but I am not disconnected from all of it either, you know. I'm going to be affected by it. Maybe the only thing, maybe my only awareness of this interconnect is I'm somehow affected by it, even if I can't turn around and sort of relieve all the suffering and all the nodes and all the strings in the net, right? So I think the basic understanding is there is interconnection there. We do the best we can in the sphere that we can influence. And that too, because of interconnection, is going to go out in some way. If we prevent suffering in some way, that suffering is not going to ripple through the rest of the net. So already we've made some kind of difference, you know. So we may not see the fruits of our labors ever or immediately, we don't know. But as bodhisattvas, we just, again, we take that on faith and go forward one step at a time. Do the best we can to be as skillful as we can be. And if we're looking for some kind of response or some kind of reward, we have to watch that as well. Am I doing good in the world because I want some feedback? Even if it's not, I want people to love me, just I want some indication that what I'm doing is worthwhile. We don't know. We just have to do what little we can, do the one thing we can do. If we get good feedback, good. If not, you know, next moment we have a chance to do something else. Other people wanted to jump into the conversation.
Just listening to people, I was thinking how hard it is. One of the most challenging thing about practicing compassion is with narcissists. It takes more than, you know, love and compassion to deal with them. I volunteered for the domestic violence shelter for 15 years or so. So it always comes up, and it's something that I'm always looking for ways to engage in wise and compassionate ways,
Mhm.
but still long ways to go. And this is a culture where you encounter that in many areas, not just in domestic violence.
So your challenge is to decide what is a skillful, compassionate response to this person in this moment. Do I feed the problem or not? Right? And I don't have an answer for you because you've worked in the field and you're going to be more familiar with those circumstances than I am, but it's easy to get sucked in, right? It's real easy to get sucked in. So this is where sometimes the compassionate response is not to give the response this person is looking for and not to enable delusion. And that's a real challenge. I applaud you for taking it on. Well, you're ameliorating suffering in the world. Good for you. Not easy, is it? Please try to not take it on in a way which is harmful to you. And do what you can. And sometimes doing nothing is the right response. Somebody else had a hand up. No? Please.
Remember how just minutes ago you were talking about you don't necessarily get positive feedback from your compassionate action. I have an intuition that compassionate action has inherent in it some quality of feeling good.
Certainly. Which would come from being in alignment with reality in this moment, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
It's the absence of dissonance, if nothing else, which is a good, positive feeling. Can we act in a compassionate way, feel the subtlety of the absence of dissonance, and not get attached to it? Because that's a reward like any other reward.
Yeah.
There's always something to do, right? It's like we're never done.
Yeah.
Even when we think we're doing the right thing, it's like there's something else to do.
And I would love to hear about South Carolina and how that connects to your, or what your education was there.
Okay. What time is it? It's probably pretty late.
It's 27 after.
Oh, glory. Okay, I'm going to suggest we do South Carolina during tea time so that people who want to get up and go can go, because we've been sitting for a long time. I appreciate it. It's a really good discussion, and I appreciate that, but I get some people might have had enough and be ready. So let's go ahead and close up. We need still to do our world peace ceremony, and then during tea time I'll be happy to talk with whoever would like to hear about that. Does that seem fair? Okay, so let's go ahead and close up and chant, and we'll do a quick reset for world peace, and we'll do that next. So, thanks for a good discussion today.